Hey guys, so in this video we're going to make our projectiles more visible using something called trail renderers. You see this projectile here? We can actually see where it's coming from now. In the heat of battle we have some idea as to where we're being attacked from, at least with the fast projectile. Okay, so I'll see you in there. Let's start off by thinking about why our projectiles are so hard to see. So I'm going to make sure that I'm over in my combat sandbox scene. I know that looks very much like Rick's scene, but it is slightly different. And I'm going to grab one of these enemies. I think this guy was Boris, wasn't he? Anyway, it doesn't matter. Put him over here. I'm just going to do a few things to make life a little bit easier with this debugging, like just turn up his attack radius a bit. And that will do. I'll start the player a little bit further away from him, maybe here. All right, now let's just get to the point with a bit more space for our scene view, where I can see the projectiles. There you go. He's firing at me continuously. Now, even if your video is slower frame rate than the game, I can assure you that in my screen, this is not very visible, this projectile. And bear in mind that if I pause the game and then step through, that this is an absolutely massive projectile. Look at it. It's at least the size of a football, bigger, I think, than a football. Crazy. So a little tiny projectile zipping along, you're never going to be able to see. So why is this? What's the fundamental problem? Well, if we to have a quick look at the stats here, the game is currently running at about 80 frames a second. And then if this projectile is coming out, what speed is the projectile? Well, I think Rick has put these in the scripts folder. In fact, that's a funny place for projectiles. Let's pop them into the weapons. I'm moving everything to do with projectiles, the projectile prefabs and the script file into the weapons folder because it makes more sense to me. Okay, so the fast projectile is moving at a rate of 50 meters, presumably per second. Well, if we set this to the frame rate, which is 80 times a second-ish, then what we expect to see this projectile do, or at least the next projectile, is to move about a meter every single frame. Now, we're a few meters apart. Let's see if that's the case. So the next meter would be maybe here, where I've got my mouse. There, just in front of that window of the house. And it is about that. Okay, so it is moving about a meter a second. Now, that's then not surprising in that you can't see it really. If the frame rate was to drop down to 40, it would only be rendered every 2 frames. So how can we make our projectiles more visible? Let's just take a look at some possible strategies. Number one, we could make them bigger, especially in the direction of travel. We could elongate those projectiles so that they're longer in the direction of travel. We've kind of already done that, though, with this guy. We could use a custom shader or some other strategy for highlighting them. But how more highlighted do you want than a big yellow tennis ball bigger than a football? But that is a possibility. Now, we could emit particles. We could use a particle system in Unity. Just in case you're not familiar with what that is, you can create yourself a particle system here under Game Object Particle System. You could attach that to the projectile and let it leave particles behind. That is perfectly valid approach, actually. If you do that, you want to use world space, because you want the particles to be emitted from the projectile and then to stay where they were relative to the world, not where they were relative to the projectiles, like they're giving off smoke or something. So that is something for you to explore if you want to. You can try creating a sub-object, putting a particle emitter on it, and making them emit in world space. I'll leave that to you for the moment. We don't need particles there. We will be using particles in this game very shortly for blood. For this example, I want to use a trail renderer because it's perfectly designed for this. It's not that different to a particle system in some ways, but it's perfectly designed for leaving trails behind things. And whichever you choose to use, and it'll be at the end of this video, I'll challenge you to use something. I just want you to consider what would happen if your scene was very dark. So if your particle system or trail renderer or whatever strategy you use is not emitting any light, then just consider whether you'll be able to see the projectiles in the dark. Just something that sometimes catches people out. All right, so that's that bit of the video. Now let's think about what comes next. I think what we want to do is we've talked about why our projectiles are hard to see, and we've also shown you some strategies for making them easier to see. So let's jump straight onto using trail renderers to help you see your projectile. So how do you use a trail renderer? Well, firstly, in your resources, I've linked you to Unity's docs about the trail renderer, and you're welcome to take a look at that. That's just on your slides, and it tells you a few things. One of the things it tells you is that a trail renderer should be the only object, the only renderer on the object in question. So this is how we would put it together. Now, we're running, before I do this, into the problem with the projectiles that we're also having with the enemies, which is that I now want to change the projectiles, and I'm having to think about changing more than one at a time, which I don't really like. So we will solve that in the next section using various strategies like scriptable objects and other things. But for now, we're just going to deal with it by the hard way. But we do have a latent problem. So I bring a projectile into the scene, and I need to then create an empty child, and I'm going to call that trail. So the idea is that the trail renderer component that you add from the add component menu should be the only renderer on the game object. Now that doesn't mean that you can't have a renderer on the projectile itself, i.e. where is it? The mesh renderer, because the trail is a sub-object childed to it. It should have a 000 transform. So just in case, reset the transform of the trail. So what's happening here is the trail is just moving with the particle. All right, so that's what's going to happen. So now we need to get this trail emitting some stuff. How do we do that? Well, one of the first things it's going to want is a material. So let's set one up for the moment. Let's go ahead and set up a material. Set the shader type to particles additive. Let's not go into any detail about why we're using that at the moment, but you want to use a particle type material for trail renderers because they leave little billboards facing the camera behind them. Okay, so we do that, and the next thing it's going to do is it's going to ask for a texture. So let's go ahead and humor it by finding any texture in the game. So I'm just going to search for texture that may do the job. Now I've got a yellow texture here. If you haven't got some sort of solid texture, then maybe just make yourself a very small texture. I'm going to duplicate the yellow texture, pop it into weapons, and Mikey, I'm sure, will amuse us by creating a much more interesting texture soon. So this is going to be called the projectile trail. And I'm going to just knock it down to, say, 64 pixels should be enough in terms of its size. And it's just a standard texture. Okay, so now we've got a texture. We can apply it to our new material, like so. So you grab the texture, pop it on, select your new material, which is of type particles additive, drop your texture on it. You've got this little yellow square. So we're most of the way there. Now, if we look back at this prototype projectile that we're messing with, remember this is an instance of a projectile, which we're going to eventually overwrite this prefab, but for now we're just messing with it to get it right. It's asking us here for a material, and you can actually have it cycle through multiple materials if you want, each time it drops one down, which can leave some really interesting effects. So that would be one for Mikey or Rick to customize, but for now I'm just trying to show you how to get this guy going. So we pop in our new material, bad name, so let's just call it projectile trail. Same name as the texture is okay, because then you cast your eye to the bottom of your asset window here and get used to working out what type of thing you're looking at. All right, so now this dude over here, this trail element, has a projectile trail on it. That's the main thing we need to do. Now, actually, even in edit mode, there you go, it'll preview that. Now, it looks a bit weird because it's facing the game camera. It's not facing us. So our game camera right now is sitting, I'm not sure exactly where it's sitting. It's sitting somewhere like up here. So that's why this thing is looking a bit weird. Okay, now it's vaguely facing the game camera, but if I came down here, then it would have a different kind of appearance. So that's what's going on there. Now, this thing obviously is far too big. So firstly, how do we make the size smaller? It's the width here. It's currently 1, which is 1 meter. And you can see that by comparison to a person, it's about 1 meter. I'm going to move this down to about 0.1 of a meter. So that's a smaller trail. We also need to look at a few other things happening, like it needs to self-destruct after more like 0.2 of a second or something. So now if I move it around, boom, 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 that's more like it. Okay, that red outline is just a selection outline. It won't have that on the actual thing. So there's other parameters you can play with here, and you're welcome to have a play with a trail renderer when I set your challenge. But for the moment, we are just looking to just get the basics going. Right, so because I'm happy with that, I'm going to then apply this fast projectile back to my default. Now be careful, if you've been dragging the trail around, you see that my projectile is here and my trail is somewhere else. Just reset the transform of the trail. And now you can test this by dragging the actual projectile and seeing that it leaves a trail. Okay, that's cool. So the trail should have a 000 transform. So if I apply that back, I can delete this instance in the scene right now, and then I can just move in range of this dude and see, oh, look at that, zap, zap, much, much more visible. Now, it doesn't look how we'd want it to look, but that's up to Mikey and Rick, or, the designer stroke artist in you to make that look prettier. But that's cool. Now, it does raise a few other issues to set us up for the next video. One is we've got all these projectiles in the world. They're never killing themselves, so we better make sure that somewhere we've got a note that we want them to kill themselves. Where is that? Prevent projectiles passing through the player. Yeah, so the other thing is projectiles organized in hierarchy. And we want the projectiles to kill themselves. Okay, so it's about tidying up and preventing all these projectiles appearing in the hierarchy. That's great. I'm not going to deal with that right now. There's a few other things we need to do as well. The other thing you'll notice with the projectiles is the following. If they're going fast enough, if we go to this fast projectile now and turn their speed up enough, watch what happens. Watch the player health going down. You get above a certain speed, and they stop damaging the player. Why is that? Well, let's pause and take a look. I think you can guess why. What's happening is if you look at that frame, the projectile's before the player, that frame is after the player. So when the game wakes up in each of those frames and makes queries, it's never actually inside the collider. So at a certain speed, it's like the bullet through paper idea, and the projectile never hits the player. So that's something else we need to sort out. And prevent projectiles passing through player. I've already got it. Cool. So that's basically the overview of how to make these guys more visible. Pretty cool, hey? So what I want you to do now is to pimp your projectiles. Use one of the strategies I mentioned on that slide for you. Make your project more cool in general by doing this. And share a screenshot with us, or an animated GIF would be even better, of the result that you have for your projectiles. And share that over on the community site. So I look forward to seeing all of your pimped projectiles and where you're going with that. And I'll see you in the next video.